Storytelling is an emergent practice, and meaning for each individual listener will necessarily be different. The relationships between the storyteller and the listeners become the nest that cradles the meaning. The storyteller creates both the context and the content, and collectively a plurality of meanings are generated through the experiences of the audience. The analysis and the critical examination are done with the utmost care and respect. Nishnaabeg storytellers, when telling in English, will use phrases such as, "Maybe it happened this way." Some people say, "That's what happened. I don't know. I wasn't there." Or, "I heard it happened that way, but I don't know," revealing that one can only speak about what they know to be true from direct experience.
Hello and welcome once again to the Spouter-Inn. I'm Chris.
And I'm Suzanne. And this time we're reading Dancing on Our Turtle's Back, Stories of Nishnaabeg Re-Creation, Resurgence, and a New Emergence by Leanne Betasamosake Simpson. I'm really looking forward to talking about this book. I think it's really beautiful.
I'm really looking forward to it as well. I thought this was a very interesting book, and I suspect it's a book that not many of our listeners have read, although, you never know.
Should we say a little bit about Leanne Simpson herself?
Sure, please do.
Leanne Simpson is a Michisaking Nishnaabeg scholar, writer, musician, and artist who's written several books of fiction, nonfiction, poetry, and song, including the novel Nupeming, The Cure for White Ladies, which was shortlisted for the Governor-General's Literary Award in Canada and the Dublin Literary Prize. And her nonfiction collaboration with Robin Maynard, Rehearsals for Living, was also shortlisted for the Governor-General's Award. So I think her work is widely known, but this particular book is specialized enough that I'm not sure how much it's read. And also, it's a few years old now. And so it could be that the conversation it's part of has moved in directions that mean that it's great to take a look at it and see where we are now compared to where we were at that moment.
It's true, and that's not the kind of analysis that I'll be able to do with it because I am not an expert in this field. And this book is, in a sense, not intended for me to read, or I'm certainly not its primary audience.
Yeah, no, and I'm absolutely not a specialist in the area of Indigenous literature or Indigenous epistemologies either, but I am super interested in this area and have felt like I've learned so much over the last several years. I'm reminded of an experience I had some years ago when first reading Lee Maricle's Memory Serves, a book that we talked about together. And I've read that book several times at this point, and every time something new and something different is coming out of it. And I really have that same kind of feeling here. It's a book that I feel like I've understood some things, and then I'm hoping that as I continue to read it, more things will become apparent, and more ways of doing things will be learned.
So this is not a book of literature per se, although it does include some stories along the way.
Absolutely. It includes stories, and also it includes a lot of, again, to come back to a phrase from Lee Maricle, word art. That is the use of language, whether it's explicitly in the context of telling a story or talking about how language works, has this very, I guess, some people might call it a very literary quality. So there are things happening here at the level of language that I think would definitely appeal to some of our listeners.
But this is a book largely about how to think of resurgence from an Indigenous perspective.
And not just how to think about it, how to do it.
That's true. It's really more about how to do it than to think about it. Well, it's both, though, because thinking about it can make you do it or tell you how to do it.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And it's one of the things that's really striking about it, and one of the reasons why I think it works so well to read it alongside Montaigne's essays, is because it's a deeply personal and specific and grounded and situated perspective that she's sharing with us here. And yet at the same time, it's a way of doing things. It's a way of being in the world, a way of being within a nest of relationships, or even a web of relationships that she offers as a kind of model or an example of a particular way of proceeding along the path that can be done by people who are parts of other Indigenous nations who are also digging more deeply into language, as she is here, as a way of grounding their way of living their lives and bringing their community along with them. And maybe it's worth picking up on something you said a little bit earlier. You're mindful that it's not a book for you. And this is something we talked about, again, thinking back to Memory Serves. It, as opposed to Lee Maricle's Conversations with Canadians, that was really about, hey, Canadians, this is the stuff you need to know to, function a little bit better on this land you seem to be living on. Memory Serves was written for people who are already situated within the framework of Indigenous epistemologies. And this book is inhabiting that same space, but that door is open. So if you want to be listening, it's inviting you in as well.
Okay. We're going to have to do this just to make sure everybody's on the same page. What do we mean by indigenous epistemologies?
Yeah, and it's a multi-syllabic and potentially maybe not the best way of referring. It's a phrase she uses, and others do as well. And I think she's using it very purposefully because while she'll use very simple and direct language throughout this book, she's also really interested in contributing to and participating in academic discourses. That is, there's a gap that's emerged that she's very mindfully kind of bridging. And epistemologies it's a fancy Greek-derived word for ways of knowing. But the specificity of that is important. It's not just knowing, but ways of knowing, like the process, the how to.
How do we know what we know?
How do we know what we know? And what is the process of coming to that knowledge? One of the things I was really struck by, getting ready for today is she talks about the need for patience and intentionality. That is, she'll share the Anishinaabe word for thinking carefully before you make a decision or thinking carefully before you take an action and so on. And this idea of deliberateness, the how you do it, is really what this book is all about.
And that specificity of using her language to give names to these terms and talking about what they mean in her communities and what her elders remember or tell her about them is also very specific because it's local to her and local to her communities, but it's something she's sending out into other Indigenous communities to say, does this resonate? What are your traditions? How does this sound to you? Tell me. Let's bring it, let's have these conversations. Does this make sense? Does this,
How do we widen out that circle? Each of us positioned within our own ancestry, within our own communities, within our own language, and on our own lands, right? And so how does that become not one flattened out common set of understandings, but rather each one bringing what they have to share to that conversation? As I mentioned earlier, one of the things that I find really absorbing and really fascinating about this book is the way in which language is. She uses the word at one point, a window. Each word is a window into a whole way of being and a way of knowing. And she just illustrates that so beautifully throughout the whole book. And as you were saying a little bit earlier, Chris, she's giving us a sense of how Nishnaabeg positionality informs her work. And it's not like this is the only way of doing it. She's talking about there being, every person is bringing their own sort of situatedness. And she describes this in a really very beautiful way in the opening chapter, where she says, what follows in this book is a beginning of an exploration of the theoretical foundations of resurgence and regeneration from within Nishnaabeg political and intellectual traditions. And I'm just going to pause there for a second because I'm so struck by the way she does that. What follows is the beginning of an exploration of the theoretical foundations. And so that carefulness, that this is a start, this is like a threshold, this is a beginning, is a really important part. And she says, it's my hope that readers will take the concepts and ideas presented in this book, return to their own communities' teachings, languages, and elders or knowledge holders, and to engage in a process where they figure out what resurgence means to them and to their collective communities. And again, right there, that one little point I think is so crucial. It's individual, it's personal, what resurgence means to them, right? She'll say, this book is what resurgence means to me at this point in my life. But it's also for their collective communities. So it's always in that situated both as an individual person, but also as a collectivity, right? She says, while this is a personal process, I believe that it is also important to collectivize these discussions and processes. And finally, she says, I know my thinking on this will change because the process I am engaged with is transformative. As my language skills increase, so will my thinking. As I move through different stages in my life, so will my thinking. So this, I can't say it, it's all about process and this moving through time.
The other thing that she does in that section is talk about how she is not going to define the word resurgence.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in a broad sense, we can talk about like, what does resurgence mean? It means, sort of lifting up the community and repositioning how it thinks of itself and how it relates to others. Perhaps I'm sure I'm explaining this poorly, but like the very specifics of what that is, she's not going to get into. It's
because it lies ahead.
Because it lies ahead and because she doesn't want to define it for other people.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. In the same passage we were looking at a little further on, she talks about what she describes as a beautiful and sacred Nishnaabeg song, commonly referred to as our prophecy song. So this is sort of looking forward to Nishnaabeg Resurgence and the seventh fire. So this is a specific to her community way of framing it. And it's looking forward, right? She says, it's a single song that has the power to liberate us from shame. Ambimajada, which means, come on, let's get going, right? So it's a call to action and a call to doing, right? And so, like you said, she's not going to define resurgence, even for within her own community, much less for any other community. It's the how to get there. She'll share knowledge with regard to that.
And I feel like now we should start talking about how story is involved in this, because, it's an interesting book. It's talking about interesting politics, but in this literary podcast, it's interesting to think about how she's thinking about and framing story as a useful tool in Resurgence.
Yeah. And, one of the things that's really neat is the way in which she, how can I put it? There's certain chapters where she talks about story a lot, other chapters where she talks about story somewhat less, but story is woven through the book from beginning to end. And one of the very early places that it shows up is in the relationship between story and land, where she's talking about story with regard to her children. And so this is like fairly early on. She says, the land reflected in Nishnaabeg thought and philosophy compels us toward resurgence in virtually every aspect. Walking through the bush last spring with my children, the visual landscape reminded me of this. We saw lady slippers, and I was reminded of our name for the flower and the story that goes with it, and then moss, and then butterflies. Then we saw a woodpecker, and I thought of a similar story. Finally, we walked through a birch stand, and I thought of nanabush, nimkig, and birch bark. Our Nishnaabeg landscape flourishes with our stories of resistance and resurgence. Right? So even though colonial people might see these stories as quaint anecdotes, she says, the stories explain the resistance of my ancestors and the seeds of resurgence they so carefully saved and planted. And this passage was specifically about walking through a landscape with her children and the ways in which the other than human relatives kind of, produce story. When story shows up elsewhere in the book, it's in these many different kinds of contexts, but always, or at least many of the times, using the same kind of language of the seed. Here she talks about the seeds of resurgence that her ancestors had so carefully saved and planted. And it's clear that the stories are also seeds. And so that's really powerful language for how the stories persist over time, and yet every generation grows anew.
It's interesting to me that she never defines story, just like she never defines resurgence. And she presents stories in many different ways, in many different formats. There are many stories that she tells or retells or includes that other people have written, not always immediately in English. And they're each presented in a different way. They each feel different, but even though they're all still story, they're all still pointing in this. And here she's including something which is not so much a story that is being told in the strictest sense. You're looking at these plants and you're recognizing the stories that are inherent to them, attached to them, that are part of them, that they are there to remind you of. They're telling you the stories, and then you might tell those stories on to other people. And it's a fairly, I guess what I'm saying is that this is a very expansive sense of what a story might be.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And as you were saying that, I was thinking a little bit about other instances that we've read together where items in the natural landscape are linked to story in some very fundamental kind of way. So I'm thinking, for example, of Ovid's Metamorphoses, where a rock with water pouring down the side of it might be Niobe weeping for her children, or a laurel tree might be Daphne, and so on, right? There are all these items in the natural world in Ovid's Metamorphoses are not just reminders of a myth, but they're actually the presence of the myth in some kind of sense. This is not at all like that, except in the way in which language is linked to, I keep saying items in the natural world because for Simpson, it is incredibly important that these are relatives. These are other than human relatives that have their own nations, that have their own, that make treaties with human beings, right? That have agreements. That's very different from the world that we saw in Ovid's Metamorphoses. But this idea that story could be yoked to the natural world and could be emergent, could be over and over again immanent in the world. There's a lovely resonance there, I think. Without conflating those at all, I think there's a beautiful kind of resonance.
Right. And so what do you do with story?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I think is quite distinctive, or at least one of the features of this book that I think is really worth noting, is the way in which she brings out how there's, in broad terms, two very different kinds of story in Nishnaabeg culture. There's one kind of story, which is sacred stories of creation, right? These are stories that are deeply embedded in the community, that are shared, that are collective, that are ordinarily not told, certainly not only told in full in the context of ceremony, in very specific kinds of settings and at particular times of year and so on. And then there's these other stories, which are personal stories, right? They're stories that come out of people's lives. And you might think, okay, there's that category of like creation stories, communal stories over here, and then this category of personal stories over there. But what she brings out as it unfolds is how one is an echo of the other, how intimately related they're almost like two levels of story that have a relationship one to the other. And then beyond that, there's another feature of story that she brings out that I think is so absorbing, and again, very much in keeping with some of the ways in which Lee Maracle talked about story when we read her work in the past. Oral storytelling can be rendered in written form, and she's going to do that in this book. But oral storytelling also is keyed to its time and place and who's present at what time of year it is, all these local features in a really, really elaborate kind of way. So a story is never the same twice, right? It's not just simply that it's heard or interpreted differently every time. The story itself is not the same. And she brings this out where she says, oral storytelling is an important vehicle for the creation of free cognitive spaces because the physical act of gathering a group of people together within our territories reinforces the web of relationships that stitch our communities together. The storyteller then has to work with emergence and flux, developing a unique relationship with the audience based entirely on context and relationships. Who's in the audience? Where are they from? Which clans are present? Which age groups? What challenges are individuals, families, and communities going through? What personal gifts does the audience bring with them? What emotions do people bring? Which moon are we in? Right? The context, she says, tells the storyteller how to decide what to tell and how to tell it. Right? And so she goes on to bring out how there's that specificity that informs what the storyteller does, but it also informs how the audience responds. The storyteller adjusts their performance based on the reactions and presence of the audience, and it becomes, therefore, an individual and collective experience. So that's, I think, in some ways you could say, okay, well, every performance is like that to some extent. But here, the actual nature of the story is different every time because it's, I don't know how to put it, supple and responsive to all of these conditions. It's an instantiation.
Yeah, it's very tricky hearing this not to want to make those kinds of immediate jumps to other forms of performance or storytelling or theater that are also very much grounded in that moment of who is here in this room, what is the situation, that are not as sacred in that sense, I suppose, as this. There feels like there's a lot of resonances. And so as the reader that I am coming to this, this is the toolkit. These are the things that I can think about that are familiar to me to help me understand what is going on here or get a sense of how that might work, which isn't to try to draw too close of a parallel to say it is that.
Yeah. Well,
Like, I'm not trying to collapse these things, just trying to use what I am coming to the table with to try to understand what might be going on.
yeah. No, I think you're absolutely right to make that juxtaposition and think about what is the common ground here and what is distinctive here. I mean, I think that totally makes sense. And she actually invites us to think about it in those terms, I think, by using that term performance, which she puts in quotation marks, but she uses it and uses it repeatedly, right? She says the relationship between those present becomes dynamic with the storyteller adjusting their performance based on the reactions and presence of the audience. We might say that of other instances of performance as well, right? She says, but the lines between storyteller and audience become blurred as individuals make nonverbal and sometimes verbal contributions to the collective event. The performance, then, whether it's song, dance, or spoken word, becomes an individual and collective experience. And I think it's that point that I think is really interesting to think about in the comparison you were making. I mean, it's true that every time a performer of any kind is before an audience, there's something collective happening. But I think what she's bringing out here is something a little bit more complex and richer than that, in the sense that the storyteller is never just an individual person telling their story. The storyteller is always telling that story from a relational position where, you know what I mean? So that the collectivity is built already into what the storyteller's bringing. I don't know if I'm explaining that kind of clearly, and like, I don't pretend to have a deep understanding of this, but I think that's a really important distinction.
There's an interesting moment when she's describing creation stories, and she's describing a telling of them. She's not going into tremendous detail, but one of the things that she does say that I thought was very interesting is that if she is being told the creation story about the first person to come to Earth, that
it's also her story.
That it's her story. That the first person is a woman.
Yeah.
And that woman is her. And that first person is perfect.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore she is perfect. Or maybe not even therefore. It just is her and is perfect. And that is the story. That is the story of creation. And then that story, which I assume all sorts of other things were brought in to, I mean, I don't know, but maybe other things are brought in to make it more specifically, make that more felt in the moment in that quote unquote, heavy quotes, performative way, to really bring this story and make it more felt so that you can walk away with that knowledge, that sacred knowledge that you were the first created thing and you are perfect.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it comes back to this idea of when is creation, right? To a certain extent, creation is at the beginning, right? And however you're going to ground the beginning. But there's a sense in which creation is always unfolding. And I think it's that she's bringing out in terms of story here. In the chapter you're just talking about, in chapter 2, she does something really interesting, is to kind of recount the creation story over again a couple of times, right? So we get the creation story sort of in broad terms, and then she comes back to it again in the way you were just describing, like grounding it with regard to herself. So she'll say, a little while later in the story, original man, or in my case, Betasamosake, goes searching for answers about both the meaning of life and the meaning of her own existence. She finds that for every question she has, Gizwe Menadu has created a story with the answers. And she goes on to say, this is our journey through resurgence. This is our responsibility. We are each responsible for finding our own meanings, for coming to our own meaningful way of being in the world. So it's a collective story, right? It's a sacred story. It's that first category of story. And it's also the second category of story. It's the personal story. It's her own story. And so she brings out that, that duality, I guess you could say, where the whole big creation story that everyone shares is also her own story of creation. And it's the story of the creation of her children, where she's playing not the role of the person who's created, but the creator. So, which is like really trippy, I have to say, is like really kind of so interesting. In closing that chapter, she says, for me, it took participating in my own creation story and the creation stories of my children through the ceremonies of pregnancy, birth, and mothering that enabled me to understand the deeper meanings of these theories. Right? So she's bringing out a knowledge journey that is personal, like deeply personal, but personal in more than one way, because there's a certain kind of learning and knowledge that comes in recognizing that the story of creation is also her own story of creation, her own coming into the world. And it's the story of her children. And each of those is a different story as well. That is, whether it's her first daughter, her second daughter.
Yeah, they're all the story of creation, and they're also a story of creation.
Exactly.
And I hope I'm not misrepresenting this, but the way that we're talking about it makes it sound like, yes, creation happened at the beginning of time, but also creation happened outside of time. Like the creation story is a thing that exists that sort of enters into time when it's needed. That might not be the right way to put it, but it's something, I feel like it's something along those lines. And this seems to be how story is, as this way of knowing the world, as this epistemology. It's out there as a way for you to understand giving birth, being born, being part of the world, or other things even beyond that. And so not only does the creation story reinscribe itself upon your birth, the birth of your children, but also the things that you do throughout your life will retell the story that you can then abstract from. And my favorite section about this was when she talks about breastfeeding and how breastfeeding is the story of making a treaty,
Mm-hmm,
which
mm-hmm.
is not a way I would have ever thought about it until I read this book. But it's a fascinating story.
It absolutely is. And I mean, I wouldn't have thought of it either when she says it. I'm like, yeah, that makes perfect sense. but before we get deeper into that, I just want to come back to something you were just saying about that whole question of where creation is in time, because I think that's so interesting and so important. It is at the beginning of things, but it's also in, like I think you said, whenever you need it to be there, or it happens at these other times as well, in your understanding of your own coming into being, your role in your children's coming into being that she describes. And you see something kind of similar, I think, or at least to me, it's a resonant moment in the opening of the book when she's talking about, she opens with this wonderful kind of procession, almost a dance that's going through the streets of Nogajiwanong, which is Peterborough, Ontario. And she describes this wonderful kind of procession and how people are going through the streets. And she says, "For me, it was a beautiful day. I've never walked in solidarity with all of our Nishnaabeg families before, regardless of our individual political orientation. I've never had the opportunity to celebrate our survival, our continuance, our resurgence, all the best parts of us. For an hour that day, we collectively transformed the streets of Peterborough back into Nogajiwanong and forward into Nogajiwanong." I thought, what's going on there? I thought, oh, that's really interesting, because it's not this movement back into the past, into the old name of the place, though that is happening as there's this kind of meeting with the ancestors, right? But it's also forward into this futurity. And it's not the same as what happens with the creation story, but I think that sense of time is maybe not so different. Like there's a cyclical quality to it, right? Or there's a sense in which futurity is always anchored in the past.
Yes, a resurgence is always happening.
That's it.
And creation is, in a sense, perhaps the resurgence of life, in a very broad sense of life.
In a communal sense, in a multi-generational sense,
and
all those things.
And in a verbal sense, like
Absolutely.
in terms of life as the act of living. And so similarly, there's that weird temporal connection between the act of breastfeeding and the treaties that have defined the course of Indigenous communities across Turtle Island. Like in that moment, in that small scale moment of mother and child, this parallel is being drawn with what I would normally think of as grand historical events.
Yeah, it's interesting you say a parallel, and I can understand saying that, but I feel like it's almost a little bit more like that relationship is a fundamental relationship that sets the terms that kind of ripple out like a stone in the water or something like that and inform every kind of agreement. So it's like, it's parallel sort of, but I think it's even more so, like I said, a little bit more that this is the intimate and primary site of agreement that informs all the sites of agreement.
Yeah.
Right.
Fair. Yeah. Absolutely.
And it's so neat when she starts to unpack that. Right. So she says, when my first child, Nishna, came along, I started to understand nursing is ultimately about a relationship. Treaties are ultimately about a relationship. One is a relationship based on sharing between a mother and child, and the other based on sharing between two sovereign nations, right? That's that parallelism you're talking about.
Right.
Breastfeeding benefits both the mother and child in terms of health and in terms of their relationship to each other. And treaties must benefit both sovereign independent nations to be successful, right? And what's really cool is she's not just talking about a mother and a child. She's like, and this is what it was like with my first child. And then she talks about her second child and the teachings that came out of that. And then she goes on a little further and says, 3 years ago, I became an auntie for the first time. And the arrival of that child again deepened my understanding of our first treaty. And so she talks about the ways in which she was able to help her sister dealing with her negotiation of that treaty with her little one.
Which was much more difficult.
Much more difficult, exactly. She talks about her sister she said, for me, the beginning of the nursing relationship had come easily, but not for my sister. She was in lots of pain and feeling very overwhelmed. The latch wasn't quite right, and it was partly my responsibility to help the two of them negotiate their new relationship. So it's like, I just love the way that being as a sister present to help out your sister in the breastfeeding is here almost like this diplomatic kind of role.
That's
right.
Yes,
and it's
right.
just so neat to have that, that alignment of these relationships.
It's a really remarkable section of the book. I also love about that sometimes, we've talked about this before when we've discussed other books, but sometimes it can feel like this line of thinking that we're being presented with is tending towards a kind of essentialism, a kind of gender essentialism, and an essentialism about motherhood and how breastfeeding is central and important and, easily beneficial to both parties. And at all points, she presents that and then complicates it.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I was reading that section about breastfeeding and thinking about friends of mine who had a lot of difficulty with that. And the way that that third story goes shows that there is still room for understanding this through those difficulties.
Mm-hmm.
And in other places, she talks about how, she is a mother and that is meaningful to her, but she also resented some of the normativity around that, the idea that, it was required for her to be a mother and that should somehow define her essentially, and that's not how she wanted to be, but that there was in fact room within this epistemology, within these systems of understanding and these stories for thinking through that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, she's quite explicit about that, saying, I am not comfortable being confined to an essentialized version of native womanhood defined by childbirth, right? But she says, I'm also someone who has been profoundly transformed through giving birth, nursing, and mothering. I will not apologize for fully participating in those ceremonies and honoring the teachings given to me through those ceremonies. So she's inhabiting this interesting kind of space where she's refusing this essentialist positioning, right? And yet, this is part of who she is. And so she wants to acknowledge that. There's this really neat passage where she talks about the question of whether we're to wear a long skirt or pants to ceremony that really kind of dramatizes how she deals with this set of expectations. And she describes the process of working through in a careful and intentional and relational way how to make that decision. But I love the fact she doesn't tell you what she decided.
Nope.
Because it's not about the result.
That's not important.
That's not important. Her answer is not going to be our answer.
It was important for her in that moment.
But her answer is not our answer.
Exactly. It's not important to the story. The story is not about the ending. It's about... Mm-hmm. Now, this feels a little cheesy when I'm saying it this way. It's about the decisions and choices you make along the way, but it is the sense of like thinking about who you are and your relations to others and who you speak to and who you consider and what you consider. That is all more important than the answer. The guidance is in how to think about it, not in therefore do or don't wear a skirt.
And not even just how to think about it. I mean, just coming back to this, it's also about what you do.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Because it's not just about what you think in your own mind. I mean, that relational quality is, and that's one of the ways she's incredibly different from many of the other books that we've read, right? This is not just about a person who's accountable only to themselves. This is a person who's accountable to many relations, right? Both ancestors and descendants, people of all kinds, right? She describes different parts of this process. And I thought of my ancestors and how they might feel watching me at the ceremony in pants. I thought of a photo that hangs in my parents' house of my great-great-grandmother on her trapline in pants. That's also worth noticing. I thought of some of the Nishnaabeg my own age, how we roll our eyes at the skirt rule. And I tried to think of a more ethical response. I thought of how my being would appear to the spirits if I wore the skirt but resented it. Right? And so she goes through all of these. She thinks about the past generations, but also she says, I thought about the coming generations. I thought about my 4-year-old daughter, and then I made my decision. And it's so neat because, we were talking before about how in Montaigne you get to the end of the essay sometimes and it's like, it just ends.
Right.
And that's a bit of what she does there in that section, right? She just sort of ends, then I made my decision. And you pause for a second, then you're like, yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah. I'm thinking about also some of the other connections that this book has with Montaigne, which, on the surface feels like a strange pairing, but there were some really interesting parallels reading these next to each other.
Yeah. I mean, they're not to flatten out the differences at all, but to notice the resonances. I don't feel like there's anything wrong with that. I feel it's actually really interesting. And one moment where I felt that in a really neat kind of way was when she's talking about what it is she's offering in this book. We talked about how she lays out what it is she's doing, and we read some part of that. And at the end of it, she says, I know my thinking on this will change because the process I'm engaged with is transformative. As my language skills increase, so will my thinking. As I move through different stages of my life, so will my thinking. And in some ways, that's a bit like what we saw in Montaigne, but in some ways, it's different. I wonder, what do you What do you perceive in it? Like, I wonder if, like, it's similar to this idea of moving through different stages, this, evolving constantly in flux. Montaigne talks about this all the time. But she says something a little different when she says, as my language skills increase, so will my thinking. And it's not that he's not interested in language. God knows he's super interested in language. But it's very different, isn't it? That Latin language, first language speaker of Latin that Montaigne is. And her relationship with language is very different, but also super important. Like, in other words, they're both changing over time, but the ways in which language mediates that change over time is totally different, I think.
Well, I think one of the things that is quite different about them is the nature of the politics.
Mm-hmm.
They both have politics, and in Simpson's politics are a little bit more explicit, with her desire for resurgence, whatever that will mean to different people.
Mm-hmm.
And Montaigne's is primarily motivated by this moment of withdrawal.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
and inward seeking, while occasionally stepping out to offer advice to future generations, how to raise children, what to do in the world, how different peoples should act with one another. He's not evolving towards in the same way that I think she is.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So even though there is some acknowledgement of change over time, and even change over time while writing it, that doesn't seem as fundamental to his process as it is to her process.
Yeah, that's a really interesting way of thinking about it. Like, if you think about what is on his horizon, what he's looking forward to, you have to say it feels like death.
Yeah, death is coming. I mean,
right?
we didn't talk about this very much, but he is constantly talking about how his body is failing.
Yeah. And that solitude, that aloneness. Like, there's this, yes, he has this incredibly evocative account of his friendship with Etienne de la Boétie, who died years and years ago, right? Otherwise, you get the sense of him as someone who's really alone in the world in some very profound sense. And this is the opposite of that.
Yeah.
This is the opposite of that. Right. And so the way in which language is mediating that change over time, that's super important, but also the sense of what's on the horizon, right? Resurgence on the one hand, as opposed to whatever that was on the other, right? No, I totally agree with you.
There's also a certain resonance. It's not at all the same thing, but there's a certain resonance in their sense of, epistemology, in terms of how to recognize truth in a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
Where Montaigne explains it as something that is more inward. Like, you recognize truth inwardly when you see it.
Mm-hmm.
And even if you're telling an anecdote or a story, even if you're telling an anecdote or a story that is not literally true, nevertheless, if it resonates, that can still get at the important thing that you're thinking of through.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And there's a moment when she's thinking about truth, and even the very word truth, where this comes into play.
Debowin. She talks about this Nishnaabeg term, Debowin, and she says the word is normally translated as truth. And she describes this process of kind of unpacking the word in order to get at the inner meaning. And she says, when you do that, then you can see that Debowin is the sound of the heart, or more specifically, in my own case, it is the sound of my heart. This means my truth will be different from someone else's. This idea has also been described by Murray Sinclair as a plurality of truth. And then she goes on to kind of bring out what that might mean. Not that, like, you have your truth over here and you over here and you over here and we're all divided, but rather we're all bringing something. We're all bringing some understanding of the truth. And so she, a little further down, says, here she's citing another scholar, John Burroughs, she says, rather than positioning this difference as tension or an oppositional framing, diversity and difference are seen as necessary parts of the larger whole. The views expressed in this book are my own interpretations as a Nishnaabeg from the Bobcat clan of the Michisapequa Nishnaabeg territory, as a mother, as an intellectual, and a language learner. For me, gender plays an important role in my own perspectives. But my understandings of gender are not fully shared by other members of my nation. Okay, so she goes on to unpack the ways in which her knowledge is situated and rooted and full and complete. And, there's a kind of plenitude there. And yet, she's just bringing one part of it. And so that's and I think it comes back to that sort of idea of relationality and being situated in a community. For Montaigne, like, he's on his own. Like, the world of the Confessions, for Augustine, like the world of the essays for Montaigne, is a world where you're kind of on your own in some really profound way. But this is different from that.
But Montaigne is also echoing. His head is echoing with bits of story, of culture, of people he's met and things he's read that he's bringing to bear on the things he talks about in a way that, while it doesn't explicitly embrace that kind of plurality, nevertheless, from what I read of it, is invoking it because he is not, nor is he interested in being, consistent.
No, not at all.
He will present things that do not line up nicely with each other, but which, in their own way, in their own moment, from their own position, ring of truth.
Yeah, no, I think that's very different. And I wonder if part of that difference, again, we can kind of ground in these very different attitudes around language. I get the sense that for Simpson, coming back to language is always the way in which you reorient yourself. And when something is not apparent or is hard to understand, coming back to language always gives you a way through. And sometimes that way is very direct, and sometimes it's very winding and involves a lot of either story explicitly, or if not story, word art, right? Like through the language takes you on its own journey. One of my favorite places where that happens is when she's talking about the name of a particular river. She says, the river that runs through the city I live in is called the Otonabi, right? So she describes how the river goes, and she asked an elder that she has a relationship with what the word Otonabi means in Nishnaabeg. He began by telling me that the first part means heart, coming from the word ode, and the word odimgat means boiling water, because when water boils, it looks like the bubbling or beating of a heart. And she goes on a little bit. And then there's this lovely, lovely passage. After I left Gediga Megizi's house, I began to think about what the word Ode means to me as a Mississauga Nishnaabeg. I thought of how Odena means city in our language, and one interpretation of the conceptual meaning of that word is the place where the hearts gather. I thought about how Odem Gizis is June, or the moon when the heartberries, strawberries, are ready. I pictured these Odeminan, or heartberries, and their runners connecting the plants in a web of interrelationships, much like cities. I then remembered that, according to Nishnaabeg elder Basil Johnston, Odene now refers to nation, which led me to think of our nation as an interconnected web of hearts. Right? She goes on, so it's like, doesn't even mean kind of winding, right? It's like, it's just because we just read it, but like, as when we were reading Montaigne, like we're wandering along this path, almost like we're wandering along a path that has strawberries on it, and knowledge is found as you proceed along this path. So it's not story exactly, but it's something like story. It's something that's connected to story, I think, because it's immanent in the land the way the story is immanent in the land. Like what she describes, how the lady slippers or the birch stand evokes a story that she shares with her children.
Well, would you think of that as an example of story as verb?
Yeah, as storying.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I couldn't
looking
agree
at
more.
the land, and it's not that there is the story, although maybe there is now that she's told it, but the land is,
well,
I would always say encouraging, but
it's a relation. She talks about this, right? It's our Mother Earth, right? It is itself animate, right? She, right, is herself animate, and the story is being told, right? And the story is emerging, right? So story. So this is something I think that I would love to think about more, and again, in keeping on reading, get a deeper sense of where does the story come from. It's clearly generated and regenerated, right? And it comes from each person who's able to be a storyteller, who's producing that story. But it's also coming from the land, and it's coming from the lady slippers, and it's coming from the heartberries, and it's coming from all of these places.
And from the language.
And the language is the vessel that it's traveling in.
Well, I think this was a very interesting book to bring to the table.
Yeah.
So thank you for suggesting it and bringing me to read it. I hope we have done it some justice.
Yeah. I mean, again, coming back to what we were saying at the beginning, that, it's with a lot of carefulness, right? And awareness that, maybe we'll get it wrong, but I feel like it's really important reading. And I just got so much pleasure out of reading it and reading it together that I'm really happy we did.
I am as well. What are we reading next time?
Next time, we'll be reading a collection of essays edited by Alyssa Washuta and Teresa Warburton called Shapes of Native Nonfiction. Came out just 5 years ago in 2019. And it's, I think, a very beautiful collection. Really looking forward to talking about some of those essays together, thinking about the essay form, but also about story. So essay and story, but also, like you were saying, the verbing of those things, essaying, storying. I'm hoping we can unpack a little bit of that. And I really love the introduction to that collection as well. So I hope that will give us some interesting things to talk about together.
Wonderful. Well, I look forward to talking about that with you tomorrow as we record, and quite soon for you listening at home. In the meantime, listeners, if you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at spouter@megaphonic.fm. We'd always love to hear from you. And show notes with links for things that we've mentioned in this episode will be at megaphonic.fm/spouter/73. And the Spouter-Inn is one of the fancy little podcasts at Megaphonic. So until next time,
Until next time, see you again at the Spouter-Inn.